Thanks everyone for joining. As Julia just mentioned, this session is focused on advances in resource adequacy. We have a great panel lined up, really with around the world, international perspectives, touching on some of the themes we've heard already on integrated planning and kind of broader workflows. In this case, how resource adequacy can fit into that broader workflow. We're going to hear about advances in methods, in tools, in data, as well as improvements in metrics, which are specific to resource adequacy. So we're going to have a couple of speakers at the beginning, starting with Aidan Tuohy from EPRI, and then Hannele Holttinen from Finland, who is serving on the IEA Task 25 group, if any of you are familiar with the IEA technology collaboration programs. And then we're going to have a couple of specific examples from Prince Edward Island and then from Texas rounding us out. So we're going to get kind of a great overview. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Aidan and I'll introduce each of the speakers as they come up. So Aidan is the Director of Transmission, Operations and Planning at EPRI, and he's going to go over some of EPRI's resource adequacy initiatives and current work that they're doing.
Okay. Thanks, Bethany. Good morning, everyone. So yeah, as Bethany said, I'll talk about some of the recent work we completed as part of a resource adequacy initiative that we just completed earlier this year. So I've talked about this on a webcast as well, so some of you will hear some familiar things, I think, but hopefully it's not too repetitive. I think we all know what the resource adequacy challenge is at the moment. We see some of the recent events that kind of show that, highlighted that. And then there's obviously the kind of NREL, LTRA and other events or other types of reports that are out there looking at, what are the increased risks. And you see, if you compare these to a few years ago, you can see a lot more risk across the country or across North America. You see similar things in other parts of the world. Winter is a particular challenge there, and the three events that have happened have been kind of winter events over the last while. And but there's also potential for other things as well, with a lot more, solar storage coming into the system. Being able to understand, do we have an adequate system is going to be important for the future. So we set up this initiative back in 2021 after EURI to look at kind of where do we need to rethink or revisit a lot of the adequacy issues. And over the past few years, as most folks would know, there's been a lot of updates already to a lot of the processes that are being used at RTOs, at utilities, by regulators and others. So a lot of these types of things are happening in process or in parallel with a lot of the activities we did here. But this was a project we started, as I said, 2021, finished late last year, early this year. We had about 25 different members. Do want to acknowledge the funders there, many in this room. Mix of utilities, RTOs, NERC are there. We also had a pretty decent external advisory group. Again, quite a few of you here that were part of that, so appreciate that. And a lot of partners down on the bottom left as well. Split it into three areas, and I'm going to focus on one or two of these today, just pick out a few particular key findings. One around the processes. How do we actually think about what resource adequacy is? What should you be actually measuring? What are the scenarios you need to measure? What are your criteria and metrics you're measuring against? The actual models and data that you're using to assess adequacy. So how you actually model the different types of supply and demand side resources, how you look at what data to use, load, wind, solar data, the generator characteristics data, all of that piece. And then the actual tools, there's a large amount of commercial tools out there. Also open source research type tools, being able to understand what those tool capabilities are, where the gaps are, and start looking at addressing some of those. So part of that, we surveyed around 20 different commercial and research grade tools to try and understand what the kind of current lay of the land for resource adequacy assessment tools is. We did a lot of this through case studies, which I'll talk about in a second, and then had quite a few workshops. All of this material is free to the public, unlike some other EPRI material, so you can go and download it on the website there at the bottom. We use these case studies to kind of illustrate some of these issues. So you can look at, there's 6 different case studies here that were representative for the types of regions. Typically, we looked at something in the near future and then something kind of in the next decade when there's more renewables, more electrification, those types of things. So we had those to kind of level set and understand things like which metrics make the most sense to use, which criteria you should assess, things like weather dependent outages. We did in some of those studies, or energy storage and quite a few of the studies that I'll talk about in a second. So The intent there wasn't to actually like really look at this specific region and try and understand the adequacy risk in that region. There's already lots of folks do that themselves for their own assessments. But really trying to understand, use those case studies to understand the changes that are needed in the assessment process. So coming out of this, there's basically these kind of 7 main deliverables that we pulled together on this that are available. First 3 there are kind of more at a high level, more strategic, looking at how do you set up your resource adequacy philosophy, what is resource adequacy, what are the principles that you need to use when you're kind of designing the process, and what are the things you might need to think about as the resource mix changes as we go to clean energy or a net zero or zero carbon kind of system. What should we be doing when we think about resource adequacy assessment? Then the scenarios, how you actually develop scenarios and select those. Part of a kind of a side project on this, we worked with ISO New England on a screening tool to identify which are the periods across large amounts of historical weather data projected for future climate, which are the conditions you should be studying for kind of resource adequacy, energy adequacy type assessments. And then the last one's on metrics and criteria. So I'll talk about it in a second at a high level on that, but that was kind of the one that when we worked with the various members of the project, that was the one that really got the most attention for most of the project. Is, you know, we need to probably revisit the standard 1 day in 10 LOLE. I know ERCOT would talk about in a while some of their work, and trying to understand what are the updates that are needed there, both in terms of the metrics that's used as well as the criteria. So metrics being the actual number LOLE, but criteria being what level of LOLE or EUE or whatever it is that you need to meet so that you've got a reliable system. And then we did some kind of more tactical stuff, which is a little bit more down in the weeds, trying to understand the models, the data, and the tools. So in each of those, we went through different types of resources and kind of looked at different levels of capabilities that might be needed. So for example, for something like modeling energy storage, the basic models, what are that kind of level 1 that pretty much everyone should have? What are the more advanced models that you might want to actually start including if you're seeing storage as a significant part of your resource mix? And what are the kind of future capabilities that might be needed as the kind of leading edge type practices? So for each of these documents, there's kind of these tables that then show what are the key issues. So practitioners can go and take those and actually understand where do they sit, what are the changes they may need to make in terms of the data they're using, or the models or the tools that they're leveraging. And then we did a gap assessment as well around the kind of future challenges, really understanding what are the things that we kind of the known unknowns, and then the unknown unknowns as well, the things that we don't have as good a handle on. Just to talk a bit about some of these, I'll talk quick, very high level on the metrics, because I know there's going to be more discussion on some of the metrics issues later, but came out with 4 metrics recommendations and 4 criteria kind of considerations. I think maybe a little less strong on the criteria just because it is quite specific to the system. But in terms of metrics, looking at don't have one metric. I think that's been pretty well understood at this point. There's a good ESIG report that TELUS led a few years ago that kind of goes through a lot of this. Looking at not just the average values when you assess across, you know, a Monte Carlo simulation, hundreds or thousands of draws, not just taking the average results there, but actually looking at what's happening at the outliers and kind of tail events or top percentile events, to better understand, you know, what when things go wrong, how badly can they go wrong, that kind of thing. Better leverage existing metrics is really things like looking at things seasonally. I think there's been a lot of focus now in places like MISO and SPP on seasonal assessment, and so being able to understand that, looking at, you know, when and how those metrics are showing adequacy shortfalls, so you can kind of better understand things like what you might do to mitigate it, and then actually describing the characteristics so you can understand what kind of customer impacts you might actually have and what does that mean from a system perspective. From a criteria, as I said, kind of a little bit more considerations. I don't know that they're hard recommendations there, but you know, it probably isn't a binary choice anymore. It's probably not okay, we've met the requirement and we're fine, and if we didn't meet it, we're in trouble. There's probably something a little bit more nuanced than that you need to think about. Multiple metrics is one of the things there. The criteria setting should consider economics to some degree, whether that's directly in the actual assessment or at least kind of thinking through what's going to happen if there is shortfalls and what are the kind of ways you're going to actually meet that if you do need to build more resources. Customer expectations as we think about the nature of risk. You know, if we're moving to winter risk type events, the the appetite or the ability to actually absorb load shedding might be a lot different. The damage due to load shedding can be very different there as well. So thinking through that and understanding the criteria in that context. And we also think there's probably no universal criteria. I know in North America, we've always had kind of the 1 day and 10. It may not be the case that we go to an EUE metric and we all have a normalized EUE of 1. It could be we need to think through other ways to do that. So that was kind of the metrics piece, and I know there's more discussion later. I just wanted to touch on 1 or 2 other things that we saw. So storage is one of the things that really comes up a lot in this. One of the key ones that we saw has a big impact on the results. Whenever we do any of these assessments, how you model storage is always a key piece to this. And so I want to just point out that there's lots of different assumptions you can make with energy storage modeling in adequacy assessment. Not to say there's one perfect way to do it or anything like that, because there's different considerations depending on what the study is trying to do. But things like how you actually dispatch storage. Is there an economic dispatch? Is it based on kind of reliability or some heuristics? Is it just using it to peak shave and kind of almost using it as a time series that you could put into a model? And then how you actually optimize it. What's your optimization window? Do you have look ahead? Do you have ability to kind of store energy now for using later? And how you're thinking about state of charge management there. How you model efficiencies are quite important and can have a big impact on results. The state of charge itself, looking at do you continuously monitor it or only monitoring it during risk periods? And then things like actually modeling of outages of energy storage as well. So a few just interesting results that we saw from some of the studies. This was the study in Texas that it's actually the TELUS folks led, and we were looking at different ways to model energy storage in Plexus in this particular case, and had the different ones there, as you can see. One thing that you can kind of notice there is the expected unserved energy, as you'd expect, is the same no matter how you optimize energy storage. You're just moving your energy around, so it's going to still have the same unserved energy. But some of the other metrics can be quite different. And so if you're going to go use this to then set capacity accreditation or understand the capacity expansion on this, you have to be pretty clear on what particular metric you should use to assess that. You can see quite a variety in things like LOLH or LOLE if you're going to use that, as well as the size and the implications of the shortfall. So this is definitely one where an energy metric like EUE seems to make a lot of sense. Another piece on the modeling, I mentioned things like look ahead. This is a bookend kind of case. We didn't have any look ahead, and it was in the SPP case study that we ran. And looking at, if you don't have any look ahead, then you get a lot more load shedding. That's obviously unrealistic. Most modelers would know you have to have some look ahead for storage, but the default often isn't that. And so being able to understand some of that when you're looking at results and understanding what you're seeing in capacity adequacy assessment is important. And then the last one I mentioned, and this was using the grid path tool that Elaine, and I think Elaine's in here somewhere, ran for us. We're looking at long duration storage in the West. So we looked at, that was probably the most forward-looking case study in the sense it was looking at very high penetrations of, and in some cases, nothing other than wind, solar storage, plus the existing nuclear and hydro across the entire West. So lot of interesting things there when you start getting into just having, you have to use long duration storage to kind of make your system adequate. So some of the modeling choices, even things like when you actually start the simulation, is it a June 1st start or a January 1st start, can have an impact on how much storage you might want to build. Looking at things like the penalties that you put on state of charge depletion or those optimization windows. And there's a lot of trade-offs there around an optimization window that's shorter is likely to be more realistic in terms of the forecast accuracy. If you start going out to a longer optimization period, then you're probably making assumptions about your forecasts that are more optimistic than they really are. But at the same time, the amount of energy storage you need might be smaller if you're looking at a longer optimization window. So a lot of interesting things we were seeing there in that. And again, you can kind of go and download that study and look at it. One other thing I wanted to bring up, and just going back to the TELUS study with Texas, given how data centers are talked about so much these days. This wasn't necessarily data centers, but it was kind of large load, the large flexible load that's been added there. We have, if you kind of look across there, we had a base case where you brought that to the 0.1 day per year. And then we said if the flexible load was 100% flexible, that it actually responded during high periods and all of it responded all the time, you obviously don't have a reliability issue with that. It's not going to make a big difference. But even if you say only 10% of that additional load, I think it was 8 gigawatts of additional load in Texas. If only 10% of that wasn't flexible, if it stayed on or didn't always come off when you had the load shedding periods or the high risk periods, you can have a pretty significant reliability implication on that. So makes sense, it's obvious, but flexible load is going to be important. And then we kind of looked at things like if you bring in that, if that load also can offset with renewables or follow renewables or defer retirements to thermal plant, you also have some benefits as well then to the system from that. So looked a bit at that and continuing to kind of look at this data center issue and some follow-on work we're doing around data center flexibility. So just to finish off then, last two slides here, just talking about some of the kind of key issues. There's a few of these that we have a pretty good handle on at this point, I think, as an industry over the last few years around additional metrics or criteria, whether that's the ERCOT and that Pete's going to talk about, or whether it's things like NWPCC that you can see here in the figure. Using different metrics is kind of becoming more common now and more thought of. I think when we started this effort, and generally speaking, a few years ago, people kind of were a little bit slower to say we should be using different metrics, but now it's starting to become a more obvious thing to do. Looking at things like the range of operational conditions and resource behavior has to be something that's part of it as well. So I know weather dependence modeling now has become quite important, and I know there's some RTOs now are starting to bring that into their actual adequacy assessments or their capacity contribution calculations. So things like flexibility requirements, things like weather-dependent outage modeling. You can see there some of the outages that you see based on the temperature is not, it's not the same as just using an average outage across the year. And then the data and models, there's the ESIG report that came out earlier this year on that, and a lot of work around putting in places like Europe to develop those common data sets and common scenarios that are being used to make sure we're kind of everything's studying on the same page and using the same type of data. There's a few things though that I think still need a fair bit more work. Extreme events is definitely one of those. We did, as I said earlier, we did some work with ISO New England on kind of risk screening and understanding some of the when you might have more challenging periods, whether it's hot weather, cold weather, those types of things. There's extreme events starting to be considered in some of the studies that are being done across the country now. But that's still something that is probably less well understood in terms of we still actually have to get a good handle on how do we develop the data sets that are needed. A lot of the climate models are not, hourly models that can be used for temperature and load and wind and solar, but being able to kind of bring some of those in and understand some of those is important. Demand flexibility has a lot of potential value. That figure there that's hard to see was some study work we've been doing with using the Servant tool, looking at a utility, trying to understand if some portion of their demand is flexible, how does that benefit resource adequacy? So you have to develop methods there to better understand how demand flexibility. It's not the same as a flexible generator. So how do you bring that into a resource adequacy study? And then also the capacity accreditation, I think, continues to be something that's worked upon. There's a lot of debate and discussion we could have on that, but won't really get into that right now. And then just a advertisement there. We've got a knowledge center that was available publicly built out of this initiative. You can go on and it's a website that has various pieces, kind of introduction to RA and then some of the more detailed discussion. So certainly if you're interested in that, encourage that or get added to that mailing list. All right.
Great, thanks, Aidan. So from the EPRI Resource Adequacy Initiative, that website that you had on your last slide, you can access all of 17 reports? There's a lot of reports that EPRI put out. So if you're new to resource adequacy, or even if you're not, it's a great place to go to get reports on all of these different aspects that Aidan was discussing. Yeah. How many reports are there, just to clarify?
I asked 15 or 17, something like that.
Yeah, it's a lot. And then also don't forget to check out the ESIG report from the task force on the metrics that you mentioned as well. Great, thanks, Aidan. Well, we'll move to our next speaker. Hannele Holttinen, who I mentioned earlier, is the operating agent for the Task 25 group within the IEA Wind TCP. And Hannele is going to give more of an international perspective. Or I guess there's going to be an example from Europe, but it's really summarizing recommended practices that came out of this international group for how, among other things, resource adequacy can fit into a broader grids integration study workflow.
That's right. Thank you, Bethany, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. So I'm actually having in my slides all of our recommended practices, how to make integration studies with wind and solar, or system impact studies or integrated planning. This would fit all of them. So I've just put into parentheses some of these that I will not have time to speak. So, but just I thought it would be nice that you would get a whole picture of this report of recommended practices, and also if you're interested, it's somehow easier often to look at the checklist that we have as recommendations in the slides. So I will have an introduction, and I will mostly talk about the adequacy impacts and the resource adequacy in my presentation. So this whole report of recommended practices, it is for providing research institutes, consultants, system operators with the best available information on, well, how to perform an integration study or system impact study with a lot of wind and solar. And you can also use it as a benchmark for any existing study that you've made. So it tries to have a checklist, what you have included, what you have not. And then recommendations on methodologies, assumptions, input data. No results in this report. We have other reports in the task collaboration for summarizing some interesting results from 18 countries that we have here. So this is also an edition 3. So we already have made this 2 times. First time we looked at smaller shares of wind, then we added wind and solar and distribution networks. And now we are having an update. We have a new simplified flow chart where the report is following. And then we have added a 3rd layer of recommendations. So in addition to small shares of wind and solar or higher shares, we also talk about wind and solar dominated systems and what is important there. We have just finished the review process, so very soon this will be available online. And this is the main flow chart. So you start with whatever scenario you want to study, and then you make these feasibility studies of operational impacts, resource adequacy, and dynamics, and finally analyzing and presenting results. So what is now different for edition 3 of this report? So one thing that we noticed that we had very briefly touched upon in the previous edition, sort of 5-6 years ago, was that there wasn't much yet seen this energy system coupling. And this is becoming more and more important for future power systems. So the future load scenarios demand flexibility from new types of loads, power to X, power to heat, storage, components. So all these provide actually potentially a lot of flexibility, which is crucial for these studies. So it's very important to take into account. And here is also an example from Energinet that I think is currently being actually presented in the other room, of potentially half of the future load will be flexible. The model tools to assess future energy systems, just as we saw in a previous session for integrated planning. So it starts with the policy planning, going more into techno-economic plant performance, unit commitment, power flow, all down to system stability. And very rarely do you see that actually there would be a feedback loop going all the way up to your policy planning. But this is, of course, what then we are moving towards with different types of feedback loops. Okay, then going for the actual recommendations. So first, we have a big table about input data. So, sorry. So for the resource adequacy part, it's important to have long time series, 30+ years is recommended. The forecasts are not needed, but for the load, you need the same things. And for the network, the cross-border capacity, and also when you take into account your neighbors. So also here, the force outage range as what is really needed for the other power plants. And what we add as a note is that the climate change impact will become more and more important. We know that the data is not yet of very good quality, but this is something that you need to assess in future studies when you look further ahead. And also the technology impact, increased capacity factors that we have for wind and solar technology is important to take into account. Something about the scenarios that I will not go here, just mainly saying that, well, if you look at anything else than very short-term studies, you need to use capacity expansion tools. And also for these capacity expansion tools, there are things that need to be improved in the model tools to take into account the demand flexibility, storage, the grid limitations, and also future options for market operations. Coming for the checks about resource adequacy, so we have formulated so that first we talk generally about resource adequacy and then also about the adequacy of the network, the transmission and distribution grid. So the main recommendations are very much similar as we just saw from EPRI slides. So basically, well, actually what we want to highlight is the neighboring areas. So the import possibilities is very important to take into account when we have larger systems. Any single state or country is not an island, and you should take this into account when you look at the resource adequacy. Of course, you need then more data to look at the interannual resource variability. So it's also more about energy adequacy, weather dependence. And then to be able to include load and storage, you need chronological models. And well, Aidan talked a lot about these metrics, so this is also something important. I have included here a couple of slides of Europe. These were actually presented in the last ESIC meeting. So there is a whole slide set of how this is done in Europe, but I'm just trying to remind you that of this very excellent work that the Tuohy is doing in Europe, constantly developing the methodology on how to do this in a very meshed, interconnected grid in Europe. So basically, they have the data coming from each of the national states, and then they do an economic viability assessment to make sure that they have an idea of how much of these generators will be still operating in future. And then they do the main resource adequacy runs with Monte Carlo simulations, and then they come up with these metrics. Here is a more zoomed in picture of the simulations. So they have many climate years with time series that are then time synchronized with wind, solar, well, anything weather dependent, the hydro and the combined heat and power, for example, and the demand. For the outages, they have the Monte Carlo, and then they have these Monte Carlo years. So they come up with 525 Monte Carlo years at the end. And this is an example of how they present their results. So we have all the EU member states here, 27. And then you have in blue the main result for all these ones. But they also look at the tail events. So they have several scenarios. And they here, the tail events is this LLDP 95. It's in gray, showing much higher loss of load probabilities for most of the countries, capturing these. And then in orange, you see a sort of 1 in 2 years event. So this is also something that is evolving and being captured more as this methodology evolves. So current considerations, it looks like every time they are making this study for the whole of Europe, they will add something new. And now they are so far doing it for a couple of years towards 2030. And now they are thinking, okay, should they do it for every year towards 2030? Would they have more scenarios and sensitivities? What about when the member states are currently discussing different capacity mechanisms to incentivize capacity and ensure resource adequacy? How can they take that into account? And how generally the national projections, the European policy, is this all reflected in a good way? So that was about resource adequacy, but very much related to resource adequacy is the capacity value of wind and solar, which is heavily system dependent. So you need to update it whenever there are changes. And we still recommend this ELCC method has been recommended for a long time, starting from IEEE and also in our first edition. But then we were looking at the sort of doing these PUCT tables for the generator outages. And this is something that you can't then do anymore in future if you want to include storage and flexibility of demand. So you have to go towards Monte Carlo methods. And here it's important that the wind solar load data is time synchronous, and you have a lot of years that you look. And finally, when you start having 100% renewable systems, then perhaps capacity value is no longer a meaningful metric at all. We also have some recommendations for the transmission adequacy. So of course, transmission planning process is something that the system operators do, but we try to highlight some of the things that you really need to do when you have wind and solar. So these are like steady state checks that you can do. And then of course you need to look at network enhancement options if any of these checks are not working. So here you would need to make power flow cases to look at the deterministic steady state security, and then also the short circuit level, so for weak grids. And I will just show you that, yes, we also go through what you need to do for operational impacts, ensure that the scenario is operable, there is enough flexibility. This is usually done by the unit commitment and economic dispatch. And here, how you do the time series, how you select the scenario, especially if you want to compare what are the impacts of wind and solar, you need a base case. That's very important because it will totally impact your results. And then finally, the operational simulations, where you need to model the flexibility, the grid constraints, the reserves. And then finally, we come also to a chapter of dynamics. And these checks, which will depend on particular system, where also we have recommendations generally about selecting cases, potentially screening studies, how to model wind and loads, and then finally the stability cases, the tools, how they are evolving. And then we have recommendations for all of these different stability cases, which I will not go further here. So finally, then you would come to analyzing the results, which could be like flexibility needs, curtailments, reserve needs, grid reinforcement needs, or reliability with different metrics. So generally, we want to say that these iterations in the flowchart provide significant insights. So you would probably need to go back in your main setup and scenario, and especially if you're comparing what is the impact of wind and solar, then the base case selected is very important, and this can have a large impact. And for easier comparison, we just recommend that you present the share of wind, perhaps curtailments, and finally all relevant assumptions and limitations for the methodology that you're choosing. So actually these checklists you can also use for benchmarking any of the studies that you make. Okay, so finally, to summarize. So we have this whole setup of studying any power and energy system design or a scenario with these checks of operational impacts, resource adequacy, and dynamics. And it's clear that most of the studies would analyze only part of these, and goals and approaches differ. All of these studies are built on so many inputs and assumptions that it's very important that these are transparently sort of described in your results. And then finally also you can use these benchmarks that we've made. And for future work, there is a lot of evolution in methodologies and tools to include larger areas, complexity, demand and storage, and also this model integrated for integrated planning, and also finally the cost versus risk reliability interface. And I would just like to highlight that this report is a result of many people working together. Here in red are the participants in our collaboration that are the main authors. So very much thank you for all of these. And here I conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Hannele. And yeah, take note of the website here that you could go and download the report once it's available, which will be very soon, any day now, hopefully. But yeah, I guess just to kind of thread the needle here, a lot of what you showed as part of this broader the workflow or flow diagram in your slide really lines up with the integrated system planning theme that we've been hearing throughout the last few days. So just to kind of connect some of the dots here. So thank you, Hannele, for talking through the resource adequacy and other pieces of that workflow. So now we've had two great presentations from Hannele and Aidan on sort of the bigger picture, more foundational pieces of resource adequacy. And we're going to transition to two speakers to round out the second half of this session, giving more kind of real world practical examples of things that are happening in the trenches in their region. So we're going to start with Scott Harper from Prince Edward Island. So I told him I would probably make a bad joke, but channel your inner Anne of Green Gables energy. I loved that book as a kid. So I told him whenever I think of Prince Edward Island, that's the first thing that comes to mind. But now we're going to have electrification to think of whenever Prince Edward Island comes up. Scott's going to talk about some of the challenges and trends that they're experiencing with electrification, specifically from this reliability and resource adequacy perspective. I'll just quickly note that we were going to have a second speaker, Derek Ellis, who was unfortunately not able to join due to a family emergency. So Scott will be covering the whole presentation, but we're grateful for him to be here. And he's, as the slide shows, the director of sustainability within the Prince Edward Island. Or no, you're with, yeah, that's right. You're with Wind Energy Initiative in Canada. Derek was going, sorry, I just read Derek's label. Derek was going to be representing Prince Edward Island. Scott is representing the wind energy in Canada. Thank you, Scott.
All right, thank you. I think I have to go home and read Anne of Green Gables again. It's been about 40 years. So yeah, so I'm going to present a few of Derek's slides here, who unfortunately couldn't join us. And I'm a bit intimidated by the timer because of his slides in here. Here's how we came to be here. So Nick Miller, who's over here, was doing a little bit of work back with us on some of what's been happening in PEI over the last couple of years, and made a presentation in Salt Lake City in June. Actually, Debbie had to step in for Nick because he lost a battle with his dog, I think, leading in. But we looked at what's been happening in PEI around heating electrification. So we don't have natural gas in the province. And our provincial government, which is part I'll touch on, over the last number of years, been trying to do a transition from basically furnace oil, diesel oil heating in people's homes to heat pumps. So that kind of set the case for what I'm here to talk about today. And I'm assuming this deck would be online for anybody who wanted a bit more detail. So Prince Edward Island. Anyone here from Canada, or many? We got a few. PEI is the smallest province on the eastern coast. We are connected by a single cable. But our provincial government, being an island, has gotten quite excited and aggressive about getting to net zero. So this climate action strategy and logo came about a few years ago. The whole why are we going to net zero? Derek could have spoken in much greater detail than me, but we've got all levels of government engaged. First Nation, industry, businesses. Our industry base in PEI is farming, fishing, tourism, all kinds of sectors where you're exporting product, you're attracting people to your province. There's also good business in moving towards net zero and more green. Basically, and I can't speak to much detail in this, but we've made some progress. The whole move towards net zero and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. We are on a pathway. Current policies are not quite yet enough to get us there, but new policies are being developed, which hopefully will see this through. Main reason that people in PEI are for the most part behind this, and it has been interesting to listen to people in other jurisdictions who are also seeing extremes and the impacts of climate change and still have that mentality of what the consumer is looking for, and watching each of these sessions, how the ultimate cost of this ultimately still has to be tested, I think, in terms of what our ratepayers are willing to see. So on the coastal hazard side, we are an island, basically call ourselves a sandbar in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Coastal erosion is a major issue, a major concern. It's impacting our infrastructure, whether it's roadways, bridges, our harbors and ports. It's impacting people's property and people's homes. So that gets a lot of people's attention. These post-tropical storms and heat events, we had a hurricane came through a couple of years ago. Fiona hit, I think, in December. 40% of the trees in PEI toppled. And firstly, looks like hell. So that caught people's attention, became a huge fire risk over the last couple of years, and was a large cleanup effort. So again, made people realize, all right, we've got to figure out what's going on. The other side, the grid went down, obviously, almost entirely from trees hitting lines. The generation infrastructure, even the wind turbines, pretty much worked its way through it. We just had lines and poles snapping all over the province from trees hitting them. I hesitate to talk about extreme heat events after watching the last presentation from Arizona. Our numbers really don't hit there, but what we have seen is a change in our load, where summer was generally fairly easy. We really didn't have an AC load, no worries on that. These extreme heat events are not only impacting the grid, but severely impacting our fishery and agriculture, where drought was never an issue. That's come up. Impact on pests, etc., have really impacted on things. And then the precipitation and rain, obviously, with these extreme events, you go a long time without any rain, and then when it rains too much. Ice storms, freezing rain incidents. We are a wind institute. We own and operate a wind farm. Freezing rain events are getting more and more frequent and challenging and concerning. So these seasonal impacts through are why their government has taken a very aggressive path towards net zero. Just the various areas we're dealing, transportation, agriculture, and buildings is where they're putting their focus predominantly, seeing some improvements in each. Some of these are going to be harder than others. Agriculture, for instance, is known to be a challenge. We are looking at EVs. There is an EV incentive program. We do like our vehicles. It's more easily done in an urban setting than rural. But there have been investments made both in some incentives for the EVs as well as chargers, etc. And again, to get the public on side, we've had a fairly successful transition towards electric school buses. One area we're now hoping to see improvement is collaboration with the utility to build that into the grid for bilateral movement of energy. So on this transition, there was different talk, and I've been in side conversations about, you know, the social science side of this and what gets people to move. When we looked at, or when the province looked at transitioning people off of furnace oil and onto heat pumps, make them free worked. Go figure. So as long as, and the threshold has continued to change, but basically you saw fairly heavy incentives made depending on household income. So there's a personal example. We installed some heat pumps in our house. I think we got about 25-30% grant. My mom, who's widow, senior, retired, they put hers in for nothing. So the transition over the last number of years, and we're about 90,000 customers, just so that number starts to make sense. So electricity in PEI, I've been at WEICan since 2007. And when I started, the peak demand in the province was around 190 megawatts. And it was a December peak. And I grew up through the days where the Christmas lights were actually what drove the peak. And we were doing all kinds of programs to get LED lights and get people to not turn their lights on so long, the good old days. We do have submarine cables through to New Brunswick, which is our connection to the mainland. There is 560 megawatts capacity, although there are market caps of about 300 megawatts. I used to say frequently, I now think it's all time. We do have 100 megawatts of fossil in the province. There's Maritime Electric, which is a Fortis-owned utility, is our prime utility. City of Summerside, I'll touch on later, is a municipal utility. So between them, there's a little over 100 megawatts. We have an equity stake in a nuclear generating station in New Brunswick called Point Lepreau. It's small. We're just shy of 30 megawatts in a 600 and some megawatt station. We have 8 operating wind farms, 204 megawatts of capacity. Solar has come quite a bit. We're up to 85 megawatts, 30 megawatts of which is commercial, 50 megawatts is residential. Carrying capacity there is obviously an issue on this topic. What we are seeing, and this was some of the areas we started working with Nick a couple of years ago, our utility is concerned, rightfully, with some of the growth that we've seen. And there is an application into the regulator to install more combustion turbines, probably 3 at 50 each. So annual loads in the province have increased, as I noted back to when I began, less than 200 megawatts into, and the presentation that was given in Salt Lake City can give you all kinds of more information. We had this polar vortex event, perfect storm of an event in February 2023, 3 days of minus 40-degree temperatures. Had a bit of a windstorm in there, knocked some power out, knocked the wind turbines off grid for the most part. We taxed our system pretty much to the tipping point. It did hold, thankfully, but we saw a system peak of 393 megawatts, and leading into that, the utility was expecting we might see 360. So, you know, just what people were doing through that event was a bit of a challenge to all. We did settle down last year, but I think everyone would agree these extreme events, unfortunately, are becoming more common. I noted the heat pump rebates. So we've got 65,000 households in PEI. 12,000 got free heat pumps, additional rebates, and another 23,000. Solar installs range from 9 to 10. We have a net metering program where basically if you generate more than you consume, you get nothing for it. So they try to size these systems accordingly. And then I know the peak power usage haven't been at Christmas before. We're now seeing this peak later in winter, January, February, because of the heating. So this is, I realize now, difficult to see. But basically through the various seasons, January is on the top left, April is spring on the right, and on the bottom is a summer. You're seeing growth every year. But the more significant growth is in the winter. So when we get into these more extreme events and deep cold, the efficiency of these heat pumps is not as good. And we do, in my opinion, need to undertake a bit of public education. People are running their heat pumps. They're not getting sufficient heat. So they're plugging heaters and they're doing other things, which is just exasperating the problem. So there's some things we have to do better on that as well. Residential solar has had an interesting impact as well, in that this duck curve that's been talked about different times, with the amount of residential solar now installed, we've made some estimates on what that is doing in a typical day, where through the daylight hours we've got load that the grid is not seeing because of the net metering of the solar, which has some positives onto the system, and also brings some really interesting storage scenarios to the table. Honestly, to the point where I noted earlier that that our local utility, we're looking for 150 megawatts of combustion turbines to supply capacity. They're now modifying that and interested in probably around 15 plus megawatts of storage, which we were happy to see in our business as a research institute. And actually, we think we may even be involved in the ownership and operation in tandem with the utility. City of Summerside, for anyone who doesn't know anything about this small city, has been a really interesting community, innovative utility. So they're small. It's 15,000 people, but they own and operate their own utility. And through that, they got into the wind business in 2011, put up 12 megawatts of wind. They've complemented that with their diesel gen plant, and they do bulk power purchasing from the mainland. Shortly after the wind farm came online, they saw times through the day. The system peaked in, I think for the utility, it was about 20 megawatts and was below 10 in the overnight hours. They did a heat for less program where they basically offered their residents low cost electricity into basically either a water heater or ceramic home furnace, to allow that energy to, in essence, be dumped to the residents to be used when it was needed, to take some strain off of the grid later. They also got into some localized production with a 500 kilowatt solar array and a small battery at Being Canada, an ice hockey arena. And a lot of the effort that they were looking at there was the demand charge that the community facility was seeing. And Summerside don't mess around. So when they liked what they saw there, they started planning. And in 2024, they put up 26 megawatts of solar, 10 megawatt, 20 megawatt hour battery, and taking that mentality from a single user to the entire city. So their expectation this year is 62% of their electricity is going to come from generated wind and solar within the city limits. Didn't talk much about what we do at WEICan. So we've been around since 1981, and the last 15 years or so, we've been heavily involved in grid integration research. We've done some stuff with Canadian utilities in the utility forum. We've done some demonstrations. We had a battery system on our site for a while, and as I noted, we own and operate our own wind farm. So we're looking at opportunities to work with our province, and ESIG has always been an interesting place for us to hear of what's happening in other jurisdictions and what other research institutes. And we do think there's a good opportunity for more collaboration from Canada. So looking ahead into that, we have seen, and the province has made considerable investments in all of these incentives to electrify more and more of our load. I'd like to say that we had the planning to match it, and I will say the utility does do good planning work, and I don't see everything that they do. But we have found ourselves with these events in the last couple of years holding our breath to a point where we're not sure we have the resource to match the need. So we're interested in working with utility system operators, governments, looking at methods to overcome the challenges that we've seen. We do see some parallels with other jurisdictions through this event, and we've seen wind go back in, or sorry, solar installed in the last 5 or 6 years in PAI. We haven't installed a wind turbine since 2014, although there is a farm under construction now. We have a very strong wind resource. Our capacity factors pretty much lead the country. Our site is at the 46% capacity factor on average, and we've been over 50%. So I know Task 25 has looked at where technology has come to to improve on some of that. So we're looking at these types of hybrid systems, really interested in how the PPAs and other market incentives work. Some of the references to Hawaii earlier were interesting as well. So that's our story, I guess. No Anna Green Gables.
Thanks, Scott. Great overview of all of the challenges and opportunities in Prince Edward Island, as well as, I guess, a little bit there at the end on what WEICan is thinking about. Maybe we can dig into more of that during the discussion, but we're going to turn to Texas now with Pete Warnken, who is recently now a director, which is different from the senior manager and the title on the agenda, on resource adequacy and ERCOT. And Aidan teed this up really nicely at the beginning, and so we're going to come full circle back to the point on metrics. Pete's going to talk about a new reliability standard in Texas that now has 3 metrics instead of a single one. So we'll get to hear more about what all's happening there. Yeah, go ahead.
All right, thanks, Bethany. And I'd also like to extend a thanks to ESIG for inviting me here to talk about this. I've been living and breathing this for about 2 years now, so kind of get it all out of my system here. So we've been working on this reliability standard roughly for 2 years. That's really kind of the phase where it's been urgent, post Winter Storm Uri. And you're going to see that a lot of this is precedent setting. Both for the world of measuring resource adequacy as well as reliability standards development. So with that, this graphic, I think, does a good job of explaining at a high level what our reliability framework looks like. So on the left there, you see how we define a loss of load event. So you basically can't cover your firm load, and then you also have to cover operating reserves. For ERCOT, it's 1,500 megawatts. And again, we're presuming that, we do rotating outages to preserve system stability. So really the heart of this are the 3 metrics. So we've got the frequency metric, which is familiar. It's a loss of load expectation. And then this is what's really brand new and really exciting is we have a magnitude and a duration metric. And these are really focused on outlier events. So it's great that you look at really normal metrics like frequency, because obviously you don't want to see a lot of outage events, but you want to manage the risk of the high impact, low probability events. So that's really what the magnitude and duration metrics are focused on. And then another new element of this is what's called the exceedance probability and tolerance. So I'll get into that a little bit later. And then let's see, I'll move on here. So this is more of a deep dive into these 3 criteria. So I already talked about frequency. And what the standard is not to exceed more than one event in 10 years. So again, that's common in the industry, and we did a lot of exploratory simulations with our probabilistic model, to look at what are the best measures to use. And so that's really how we came up with these. We looked at over 100 different simulation scenarios, looking at different resource mixes and retirements and things like that, just to understand in a really robust way, how these would operate within the, the context of a reliability standard and how you would model this. So again, what's critical for frequency, or excuse me, for magnitude and duration is, again, this is a maximum. So that presents some, I think, unique challenges because in a modeling context, you're going to get a lot of outliers. And again, you have to address those in the context of the reliability standard. And that's where that, exceedance probability concept comes in. So I'll get into that in more detail later. And then again, magnitude, it's a maximum amount of electricity lost during any single hour of a potential outage. Duration is pretty obvious, maximum duration of a loss of load event during a grid outage. And it's expected to last less than 12 hours. So that's the reliability part of it for duration. And then magnitude is very interesting because That's really a kind of a dynamic type of measure, because it really determines on the capability of the transmission providers to shed load and to rotate it. And I'll get into that a little bit more detail later. Okay, I want to get into the process requirements of this because the fun is just beginning. How do we implement this and actually measure the success of the reliability standard? So our Public Utility Commission is having us do what they call reliability assessments once every 3 years. And at that time, we determine if there's deficiencies with meeting the reliability standard, right? The 3 criteria. And then what we have to do is come up with options for modifying our market. So these are market design changes. We do that in coordination with our independent market monitor. So we don't have a capacity market, so you can't tweak that. So you have to tweak, different incentives, to get more generation, both, kind of in real time as well as, longer term investments. And then in terms of the timeline of this, we're going to be starting this first reliability assessment in 2026. And then we're going to be simulating the years 2026 and 2029. And 2026 gives us a baseline to kind of start off things. And then part of this is we have to come up with a modeling assumptions document, pass that along to our commission to get, review and approval, and a big role for the public to go through that as well. Okay, so I want to get into the rationale a bit. So I did talk about, the probabilistic, measures, why they're important. Again, you're really focused on those outlier events. And if you're not capturing that, I think you're missing a big picture. So again, we did want to include kind of a frequency measure, common in the industry. We do think it's a useful measure to retain. So that's why we have it. Okay, one of the things that brought up a lot of discussion was, why don't you use expected unserved energy as a metric? So we had a lot of our market participants support that. And so, kind of here's our perspective on it. The issue with unserved energy is, again, it doesn't distinguish between this duration and magnitude concept. So you'll see here in these 2 charts, what it's showing is, 2 events, again, for an hour, or multiple hours, actually. So you have expected unserved energy that's the same amount for these 2 outage events. On the left, you're seeing that there's a duration issue. The dotted line is your constraint. So that would be your reliability criteria. So on the left, 60 megawatt hours, you still have a magnitude issue there. You can see that. On the right, you see that it's a duration problem. So you've got some hours that extend beyond your, the dotted line there. So you have, again, the same unserved energy, but totally different characteristics in terms of risks profiles. So, our issue is that expected unserved energy, I think, is useful, but it doesn't get at really, again, these risk attributes of specific outage events. Now, we will be calculating unserved energy, expected unserved energy as a measure. So that will be part of our reliability assessment. Again, it's just not part of that 3 set, reliability criteria that I've talked about. And it's also useful for calculating the incremental cost of reliability standards. So it still is a useful metric. So I mentioned the importance of exceedance probability, and if you're modeling, extreme outlier events. So exceedance probability, that's common in, weather forecasting and other things. But basically the idea is you're going to have outlier events, and you're not going to be able to afford to remove those, right? So they're very low probability, but it would be extremely expensive to try to, eliminate the probability of them happening. So you build in an exceedance probability. For example, here in the chart on the slide, I say like a 1% exceedance probability. So you're allowed to exceed your thresholds by a certain amount. So it sort of gives you a cushion, so to speak. And again, that's important for these metrics that focus on outlier events. And then exceedance tolerance, that's what your kind of threshold levels are for your exceedance probability. And that's really a policy decision. It's not ERCOT. We did do some examination of what different exceedance tolerances would give you in terms of, reliability and the cost of the reliability level that you're selecting. So we did a lot of research, a lot of simulation on it, but it was ultimately our commission that had to decide those exceedance tolerance levels. And then here's a graphic example of what I'm talking about. So this is a portfolio that was developed to a 0.1 per year loss of load expectation. It's almost a 19% reserve margin. And you'll see here at 13, and then that's the duration, that's the y-axis. And then the magnitude is the x-axis. And you'll see the points where, and each one of these dots is an outage event. So you'll see if you set your exceedance probability to 1%, you have a handful of dots outside of that, the dashed red lines there. And if you increase the probability to 2%, you'll see a lot more dots in there. So you're basically saying that that's an acceptable set of outage events. Again, acknowledging that it's very rare that those would happen in practice. Okay, so what I wanted to do is cover modeling challenges. Again, there's really nothing new here. We've been talking about this throughout the workshop. But, they say everything's bigger in Texas. So I think a lot of these modeling challenges are pretty big. Again, there's been a lot of discussion about load forecasting and how complicated that is. Large loads, electrification, electric vehicles, rooftop solar, distributed resources, and energy storage charging. And large loads is obviously particularly important because Texas has been providing incentives to get these large data centers and crypto mining facilities out there. And I remember maybe 4 or 5 years ago, it was a big deal to get a liquefied natural gas facility on the coast, maybe 400 or 500 megawatts at a time. So wow, that's a big deal. And now we're talking about 2, 3, 4 1,000 megawatts at one time, and it's pretty scary. So a big part of that is trying to address that both from a transmission planning perspective, but also how do you include the impact of that in the modeling we do for resource adequacy. So that's not a big ongoing challenge. Extreme weather event modeling, again, that's critical for extreme event, trying to characterize those extreme events. And the problem is we don't have a lot of good historical data. We've got these big winter storm events, fairly recently. So we've got very good data on that, but they're infrequent. And you don't have good data going back, many decades, which is what you need. So again, we need better data, better historical information, more statistical analysis on, how do you, sort of create, representative winter storm events. And also, summer events too, where you've got, renewable droughts and things like that, but you need to try to model. So that's a big challenge. Modeling price responsive demand. Again, that's a very difficult thing to be able to model. Again, you have to depend on, surveys, again, looking at the pricing programs and seeing what the actual response is. So a very complicated and big problem to try to address. Supply deliverability impacts. Again, we're trying to really consolidate what we do on resource adequacy and transmission planning. I know that other RTO ISOs do that, but that's new for ERCOT. So again, where do you cite the generation to get the biggest benefit, at least for ERCOT and reliability? So that's something we have to tackle. Resource capacity expansion. So we've got all these new technologies that are coming up, modular, nuclear, and a whole bunch of other things that are new. And how do you model them effectively? Again, given that you don't have a lot of information, and a lot of these are like in pilot phase or things like that. And again, you're trying to look at many years in the future. Market design. So I mentioned that that's part of the reliability standard. If we're deficient with the standard, then we have to come up with some market design changes to, get us back to where we want to go. So, that's certainly complicated. There's, ways to look at it from, more real time or day ahead perspective, or again, longer term, resource investment. And so again, there's kind of the right mix, what are the impacts? So it's like again, a fine balancing question. How do you get the right mix? And then mention energy storage impact. So that's been growing at, 1 minute. I didn't think I could do this in 15 minutes. Yeah, energy storage impact. So that's been growing just at an incredible rate. As a couple hundred megawatts of energy storage a couple of years ago, and we're talking about 5,000-6,000 and growing up to 20,000 and more in a short period of time. So we're still working on the rules of the road. How do you integrate these energy storage systems? How do you manage state of charge? The duration aspects. How do you model that? Again, if you model something that's an hour versus 4 or 8 or 12 hours, that makes a difference in terms of how that impacts energy requirements and the like. So again, there's a lot of effort to improve how we do that and try to mirror the new rules that ERCOT has been working on. And so that is all I have. So thank you very much.